They thought it was the funniest joke Silver Creek had ever seen. The town's elite, bored and cruel, looked at Claraara May. A woman they mocked for her size and decided to feed her to the wolves. They bet her she couldn't last 5 minutes at the Jericho ranch. They told her the reclusive rancher needed a gentle hand for a wild stallion, but they were sending her there to be humiliated, terrified and chased off by a man rumored to be as savage as his horses. They expected her to come running back in tears. But they made one fatal calculation. They didn't realize that while they were laughing at her weight, she was the only one in town with the strength to carry the burden of a broken man's heart. This is the story of how a cruel prank turned into a legend. The year was 1889, and the town of Silver Creek, Montana, was a place where reputation was worth more than gold and kindness was in short supply. If you weren't wealthy, beautiful, or dangerous, you were invisible, or worse, you were a target. Claraara May Jensen was the latter. Clara was 24 years old, and in a town that prized willow-thin waists and delicate features, Clara was an anomaly. She was a large woman, heavy-set, her mother would say with a sigh, obese, the town drunk would slur, the barn, the cruel schoolboys would whisper as she walked past. She worked at the back of the mercantile, hauling flour sacks that grown men complained about, hiding her face beneath a wide bonnet. She had a heart of gold and a singing voice like a lark, but no one in Silver Creek cared about that. They only saw the space she took up. The drama began on a scorching Tuesday inside the Gilded Spur Saloon. Buford Clancy, the mayor's son, was holding court. Beaufort was handsome, rich, and rotten to the core. He was bored. The cattle drive wasn't for another month, and he had run out of people to torment. "I bet I can get a laugh out of the whole town by sundown," Beaufort announced, swirling his whiskey. His lackey, a thin rail of a man named Silas, grinned. "How's that bow?" Beaufort looked out the window and saw Claraara May walking down the dusty street, carrying a basket of laundry. She moved slowly, the heat clearly taxing her, wiping sweat from her brow. "You see, Clara," Beaufort pointed. "I heard Jericho Staines is looking for a horse breaker. That black stallion of his widowmaker nearly took his foreman's arm off last week." The bar went silent at the mention of Jericho Staines. Staines was a ghost story in the flesh. He owned the Double Rock Ranch, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, but he lived like a hermit. Rumor had it he was scarred, violent, and hated people. He had fired every hand who dared look him in the eye. "So?" Silas asked. "So?" Beaufort snickered, a cruel glint in his eye. "We tell Clara that Jericho sent for her. We tell her that he's heard she has a gentle spirit with animals. We tell her he wants her to tame Widowmaker." The men at the table erupted in laughter. The idea of Claraara May, heavy, slow, shy, Clara trying to mount a wild stallion or even stand in the same barn as the terrifying Jericho Staines, was comedy gold to them. "She'll be crushed," one man chuckled. "Staines will take one look at her and laugh her off the property, or shoot at her feet to make her dance." "That's the point," Beaufort said, slamming his glass down. $10 says she comes running back crying before supper. We'll be waiting on the porch to welcome her back." They set the trap within the hour. They cornered Clara outside the mercantile. They didn't mock her this time. They used honeyed words. Beaufort took off his hat, feigning respect. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity, "I have a message from Mr. Staines. He's in a bind. That prize horse of his is sick with grief. And he heard you raise that orphan foal last winter. He needs a woman's touch. a substantial presence to calm the beast. Clara clutched her basket tighter. Mr. Staines. The man who lives in the canyon. The very same, Silas added. He's desperate. He specifically asked for you. Said he needed someone strong. Someone who won't break. Clara's heart fluttered. No one ever asked for her. No one ever thought she was useful for anything other than heavy lifting. The thought that the wealthy rancher knew her name, that he needed her, lit a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. She looked at their faces looking for the lie, but she wanted to believe it so badly that she blinded herself to the smirk twitching on Buford's lip. I don't know, she stammered. He's paying $50, Buford lied. $50 was a fortune. It could fix her father's leaking roof. It could buy her a new dress, one that actually fit. I'll go, Clara whispered, as she walked toward the edge of town, dragging her heavy boots through the dust toward the looming canyon. The laughter from the saloon finally erupted behind her, but she didn't turn back. She kept walking straight into the lion's den. The walk to the Double Rock Ranch was 3 miles of uphill torment. By the time Clara reached the iron gates, her dress was soaked through with sweat and her lungs burned. Her legs, thick and chafed, screamed for rest, but pride kept her moving. The ranch was silent. It wasn't like the bustling farms in the valley. This place felt like a fortress. The main house was a sprawling timber structure, dark and uninviting with curtains drawn tight against the sun. Clara moved toward the massive barn, the smell of hay and old leather filling the air. She expected a foreman to greet her, or Mr. Staines himself, but there was no one. Just the wind whistling through the slat wood. "Hello," she called out. Her voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. A loud, thundering bang echoed from inside the barn. Then a scream, not human, but equine. A horse, angry and terrified. Clara pushed the heavy barn door open. It creaked loudly, and she stepped into the shadows. In the far stall, a beast of a horse was rearing up, kicking the wooden slats with terrified violence. It was Widowmaker. He was jet black, massive, with muscles that rippled like water under oil. He was foaming at the mouth, his eyes rolled back in white panic. "Easy," Clara whispered, stepping closer instinctively. She forgot the heat. She forgot the walk. She forgot her size. Clara had always understood animals better than people. People judged. Animals just felt. And right now she could feel the waves of terror coming off this animal. She saw the problem immediately. A rope had tangled around the stallion's back leg, and in his panic he had tightened it, cutting off circulation. He wasn't mean. He was in pain. "You poor thing," she cooed. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming a low, steady hum. Most people would have run. A horse that size could kill a woman like Clara with a single kick. But Clara didn't run. She moved with a surprising, fluid grace. She didn't approach him like a predator. She approached him like a boulder, steady, unmoving safe. She reached the stall door. The horse pinned his ears back and snapped his teeth. "I know," she said softly. "I know it hurts. They tied you up wrong, didn't they?" She opened the latch. Suddenly, a cold, deep voice boomed from the hayloft above. "Get away from that stall if you want to live." Clara froze. She looked up into the shadows of the loft. A man stepped into the sliver of light filtering through the roof. It was Jericho Staines. He was a giant of a man, taller than any man in town, with shoulders that filled the doorway. He wore a dusty black coat, and his face was covered in a thick, unkempt beard. A long scar ran from his temple to his jaw, cutting through his eyebrow. He held a rifle loosely in one hand. "Who are you?" Jericho demanded, descending the ladder with heavy thuds. "And why are you trying to commit suicide on my property?" Clara's throat went dry. He was terrifying. He was every bit the monster the town said he was. I'm Claraara May," she managed to squeak out. "Mr. Clancy sent me. He said you asked for me, to help the horse." Jericho stopped 10 feet from her. His eyes, the color of cold steel, swept over her. He looked at her worn boots, her sweat-stained dress, her large frame trembling in the dim light. He didn't laugh, but his expression darkened with fury. "Clancy." Jericho spat the name like poison. "I didn't send for anyone. Especially not—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The realization hit her like a physical blow. There was no job. There was no request. It was a joke. They had sent the fat girl to the scary man's house to see what would happen. Tears pricked her eyes. She wanted to vanish. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I see," Clara whispered, backing away. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir. I'll go." She turned to leave, shame burning through her chest. Crack! The sound of wood splintering stopped her. Behind her, Widowmaker had kicked through the stall rail. His leg was still caught, and he was thrashing about to break his own bone. Jericho cursed and lunged forward, grabbing a lasso. "Get back!" he yelled at Clara. "He's going to break his leg." Jericho moved to enter the stall to cut the rope, but the stallion lunged at him, teeth baring. Jericho had to dive back to avoid having his skull crushed. The horse was unreachable, a whirlwind of hooves and fury. "He won't let me near him," Jericho roared, frustration etched on his face. "I have to put him down before he destroys himself." He raised the rifle. "No!" The scream tore from Clara's throat before she could stop it. Jericho hesitated, looking at her. "He's suffering, woman. I can't get close enough to cut the rope." "I can," Clara said. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. "You," Jericho scoffed. "He'll kill you." "He's not scared of me," Clara said, stepping past Jericho. "I'm not a threat to him. You smell like gunpowder and anger. I smell like flour and sweat." "Don't be a fool," Jericho warned, reaching for her arm. Clara pulled away. She walked straight up to the shattered stall. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't make eye contact with the horse. She simply leaned her heavy body against the wood, letting the horse feel her weight, her solidity. She began to hum, a low, vibrating melody. The stallion screamed again, but Clara didn't flinch. She slipped through the broken rail. Jericho watched his rifle lowered, his mouth slightly open. He watched as this woman who had been trembling moments ago walked into the kill zone. Clara moved slowly. She didn't grab the horse. She simply stood next to his flank, singing softly. Widowmaker trembled. He sniffed her. She smelled like warmth. She was big like him. She wasn't a spindly cowboy trying to break him. She was a presence. The horse stopped kicking. With a movement so smooth it looked like magic, Clara reached down. The horse flinched, but she kept her hand on his flank, grounding him. Her fingers worked the knot of the rope. It was tight, digging into the flesh. "I've got you," she whispered to the horse. "I've got you." With a grunt of effort, using the strength she had built, lifting flour sacks for 10 years, she yanked the rope free. The tension in the horse snapped. He let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned his massive head against Clara's shoulder. For a moment, the only sound in the barn was the heavy breathing of the horse. Clara stood there, her hand buried in the black mane, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief that she wasn't useless. She turned to look at Jericho. The rancher was staring at her. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by something Clara had never seen in a man's eyes when he looked at her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't mockery. It was shock. And respect. "You," Jericho started, his voice rough. "You just saved my best horse." Clara wiped her face, the shame of the prank returning. "I'll go now, Mr. Staines. Tell Beaufort he won his bet. The fat girl made a fool of herself." She began to walk out of the barn, her head down. "Stop," Jericho commanded. Clara stopped. "You're not walking back to town," Jericho said. He walked over to a hook on the wall and grabbed a set of keys. "And you're certainly not telling Beaufort Clancy he won anything." He stepped into the light, and for the first time Clara saw him clearly. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man who looked as lonely as she felt. "You're hired," he said. Clara blinked. "What? You're hired," Jericho repeated firmly. "Nobody can touch that horse but me, until today. You have a job here, Miss Clara, if you want it." "But the prank—" "The prank is over," Jericho growled, his eyes narrowing toward the road leading back to town. "Now the real game begins, and I intend to make sure Beaufort Clancy regrets the day he sent you to my door." The ride back to town to collect Clara's belongings was the longest 40 minutes of Clara's life. She sat on the bench of the buckboard wagon next to Jericho Staines, keeping as much distance between them as the wooden seat allowed. Every bump in the road made her wince, acutely aware of how much space she took up, terrified that the wood might creak or snap under her weight. Jericho said nothing. He drove the horses with a casual, terrifying competence. His large hands held the reins loosely, but Clara had seen the violence those hands were capable of, and the gentleness. When they pulled up to the shack Clara shared with her parents on the outskirts of Silver Creek, the shame returned. It was a leaning, miserable structure with a roof that sagged like a tired spine. Her father, a bitter man named Jebediah, who spent his days whittling and complaining about his bad back, was sitting on the porch. "You back already?" Jebediah grunted, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Told you. Useless." Clara flinched. She moved to step down from the wagon, but the height was difficult for her knees. Usually she would scramble down, awkwardly humiliated. Before she could move, Jericho was on the ground. He walked around the wagon. He didn't offer a hand like a gentleman suitor. He simply stood there, a solid wall of muscle, blocking her father's view of her struggle. "She's not back," Jericho said, his voice carrying like thunder across the small yard. "She's packing." Jebediah squinted. "Who the hell are you?" "Jericho Staines." The name hit Jebediah like a bucket of ice water. He scrambled to stand up, knocking over his whittling knife. "Mr. Staines, the Double Rock Staines." "She has a job," Jericho said, ignoring the man's sudden groveling tone. "Cook, housekeeper, horse trainer. Pay is $50 a month, room and board included." Jebediah's jaw dropped. $50 was more than he made in a year. 50 for her. He laughed, a cruel wheezing sound. "She eats more than $50 worth of food in a month, Staines. You're making a mistake. She's slow. She's heavy. She'll break your furniture." Clara froze on the wagon seat. This was her life. This was the soundtrack of her existence. She waited for Jericho to laugh, to agree to realize he had made a bad investment. Jericho didn't laugh. He slowly turned his head to look at Jebediah. The scar on his face seemed to throb in the afternoon heat. She tamed a stallion in 5 minutes that 3 men couldn't touch in 5 years, Jericho said quietly. If she eats $50 worth of food, I'll buy her 100, because unlike you, she earns her keep. He turned his back on Clara's father. Go get your things, Clara. Take only what matters. Leave the rest. Clara scrambled into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She packed her 2 dresses, her worn Bible, and a small wooden box containing her grandmother's silver comb. She left the rest. She left the misery, the mockery, and the narrow cot that smelled of mildew. When they returned to the Double Rock Ranch, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in bruised purples and bloody oranges. You'll take the guest cottage, Jericho said, pointing to a small, sturdy stone building separated from the main house by a vegetable garden. It has a stove. It's private. He didn't put her in the barn. He didn't put her in the servants' quarters in the attic. He gave her a house. The first week was a brutal adjustment. The Double Rock was a working ranch, and Jericho worked harder than any man Clara had ever seen. He was up before dawn and worked until long after the stars were out. He expected Clara to work too, but the dynamic was strange. He didn't bark orders. He didn't micromanage. He simply expected things to be done. Clara took over the kitchen first. The main house was a disaster of bachelor living, dust thick on the mantel dishes, piled in the sink, the air stale. She scrubbed until her fingers were raw. She swept until her back screamed. But she didn't stop. For the first time, her size felt like an asset. She could lift the heavy cast-iron pots with ease. She could haul the water buckets from the pump without stopping for breath. But the real test came at dinner on the 3rd night. Clara cooked a stew. Rabbit potatoes, carrots, and wild onions she had found by the creek. She made biscuits, thick and fluffy with the last of the flour. She set the table in the dining room for Jericho, then turned to take her plate back to the kitchen to eat alone, as she had always done in town when she worked for families. "Where are you going?" Jericho asked from the head of the table. He hadn't touched his spoon yet. "To the kitchen, sir," Clara said. "To eat." "I don't eat alone," Jericho grumbled. "Sit down." "But it's not proper. I'm the help." "You're the only other human being for 10 miles, Jericho said, looking up at her. His eyes were tired. "Sit. Down." Clara sat. She chose the sturdiest chair, terrified it would creak. It held. They ate in silence for a long time. The stew was hot and rich. Jericho ate voraciously. He wiped the bowl clean with a biscuit. "My mother used to make biscuits," he said suddenly. It was the first personal thing he had said to her. "Yours are better." Clara flushed pink. "Thank you." "The boys in town," Jericho said, pouring himself a glass of water. "They give you a hard time about your weight." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Clara looked at her lap. "Yes, sir. All my life." "Why didn't you leave? Where would I go?" Clara whispered. "Who would hire me?" "A woman like me. I'm not decorative." Jericho leaned back. The wooden chair groaned under his massive frame. "Decoration is for Christmas trees. Out here, pretty things die. Strong things survive. You have good hands, Clara. You have a quiet mind. The animals trust you. That's worth more than a 20-inch waist." He stood up, taking his plate. "I reinforced the bed frame in the guest cottage today, And the chairs on the porch used iron bracing. Clara felt a hot spike of humiliation. You didn't have to. I didn't do it, so you wouldn't break them. Jericho interrupted, his voice stern. I did it, so you wouldn't have to worry about breaking them. I want you to rest when you're done working, not perch on the edge of a seat scared to death. You live here now. You take up space here. Get used to it. He walked out the back door to check the horses, leaving Clara sitting at the table, stunned. He hadn't mocked her. He had reinforced the furniture so she could feel safe. Clara put her head in her hands and wept. For 24 years, the world had told her to shrink. Jericho Staines had just built her a world where she was allowed to be big. 2 weeks passed. The change in Clara was subtle at first, then undeniable. The constant tension she held in her shoulders began to dissipate. The air at the Double Rock was clean free of the whispers and giggles of the town. She spent her mornings cooking and cleaning, and her afternoons in the corral with Widowmaker. The stallion, now named Midnight by Clara, she told Jericho that Widowmaker was a rude name for a horse with a sensitive soul, followed her like a puppy. Jericho watched from the porch, smoking his pipe, as Clara brushed the massive beast. The horse would rest his chin on her shoulder, and she would sing hymns to him. Jericho had never seen anything like it. But supplies were running low. They needed flour coffee and sugar. We go to town tomorrow, Jericho announced at supper on a Friday. Clara's spoon clattered against her bowl. Can't I stay here? I can make a list. No, Jericho said. You need boots. Your soles are worn through, and I need you to pick out the fabric for the curtains you keep talking about. I don't want to see them, Jericho, Clara said, using his first name for the first time without Mr. Beaufort. Silas. They'll just start again. Jericho's eyes went dark, a storm gathering behind the grey irises. He reached across the table, a rare gesture of contact, and placed his large, calloused hand over hers. Let them start, he said softly. But I promise you, Clara, this time, the ending will be different. Saturday morning broke clear and hot. Jericho hitched the team to the buckboard. He had shaved his beard down to a neat scruff, revealing a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite. He wore a clean black coat and a wide-brimmed Stetson. Clara wore her best dress, a simple blue calico. It was tight in the arms, but she had washed it until it was spotless. She climbed onto the wagon, her breathing shallow. The ride to Silver Creek was tense. As the town came into view, Clara felt the familiar urge to hide, to hunch her shoulders and disappear. Chin up, Jericho commanded, not looking at her. You walk beside me, not behind me. They pulled up to the hitching post in front of the general store. The street was busy. It was market day. The moment Jericho Staines stepped off the wagon, a hush fell over the street. He was a legend, a boogeyman, and he rarely came to town. But the silence deepened when he walked around and offered his hand to Claraara May. She took it. He gripped her fingers tight, grounding her. She stepped down. They walked towards the store. People stared. Whispers hissed like stayluks in the grass. Is that Clara? With Staines? Is she still alive? They were halfway to the door when the saloon doors swung open. Buford Clancy stepped out, a cigar in his mouth, flanked by Silas and a few other roughnecks. Buford stopped. He blinked, looking from Jericho to Clara. A slow, nasty grin spread across his face. Well, well, Buford called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear. I'll be damned. The beast didn't eat the beauty, or... well, I suppose beauty is a stretch. The men around him chuckled. Clara's grip on Jericho's arm tightened until her knuckles were white. Jericho stopped. He turned slowly to face Beaufort. He didn't let go of Clara. "You have something to say, Clancy?" Jericho asked. His voice was low, but it carried a terrifying weight. "Just surprised to see you, Staines," Beaufort sneered, stepping off the porch. "We figured you'd run her off by now, or maybe you kept her around for... warmth gets cold in that canyon, don't it? A big girl like that keeps the bed real steady." The insinuation hung in the air, gross and heavy. The townspeople gasped. This was an insult to a woman's honor, and in the West men died for less. Clara wanted to die. She tried to pull her hand away to retreat, but Jericho held her fast. Jericho released her hand gently and took 2 slow steps toward Beaufort. He towered over the mayor's son. Beaufort was rich and mean, but Jericho was a man who broke wild horses with his hands. "You think this is a joke?" Jericho said. "You sent a woman to my ranch hoping she'd get hurt, hoping she'd be humiliated. You bet money on her pain." "It was just a bit of fun, Staines," Beaufort said, his smile faltering as Jericho got closer. "Don't get your panties in a twist." "Clara runs my ranch," Jericho announced to the crowd. "She manages my accounts. She trains my stock. She is worth 10 of you, Clancy. And if I ever hear you speak her name with anything less than the respect due to a queen, I will pull your tongue out of your head." Beaufort bristled, his ego bruising. "You can't threaten me. My father owns this town. He owns the bank that holds the note on your land, Staines. You touch me and we foreclose. We'll take the double rock and burn it to the ground." The threat was real. The Clancy family did own the bank. They had squeezed many ranchers out before. Jericho smiled. It was a cold, wolfish smile that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, folded piece of parchment. He held it up. "You mean this note?" Jericho asked. Beaufort squinted. "What is that?" "I stopped by the city of Helena last week," Jericho said calmly. "I visited the regional bank. Seems your father was over-leveraged on that mining deal in the south. He needed cash fast. He sold the debt on several properties to cover his losses." Jericho took a step closer, tapping the paper against Beaufort's chest. "I bought the note, boy. I don't owe your father a dime. Your father owes me. I own the debt on the Double Rock, and I own the debt on the Mercantile, and, interestingly enough, I now hold the deed to the Gilded Spur Saloon." Beaufort's face went pale. The cigar fell from his mouth. "You're lying." "Get out of my saloon," Jericho said pleasantly. "You're barred. And tell your father if he wants to keep his house, he better learn to tip his hat when Claraara May walks down the street." Jericho turned his back on the stunned men. He offered his arm to Clara again. "Shall we get your fabric? Miss Clara." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with shock and adoration. She took his arm. "Yes, Mr. Staines, we shall." They walked into the Mercantile like royalty. For the first time in her life, Clara walked with her head high. She wasn't just the fat girl anymore. She was the woman who stood beside the most dangerous man in the territory, and he had just brought the town to its knees for her. But as they shopped, selecting a beautiful bolt of yellow calico that reminded Clara of sunflowers, neither of them noticed Silas slipping away from the crowd outside. Silas didn't go to the mayor. He rode hard out of town, heading toward the shadowy ridges of the Devil's Spine, where a group of cattle rustlers known as the Red Sashes made their camp. Beaufort Clancy wasn't the type to lose gracefully. If he couldn't beat Jericho with money, he would burn him out with fire. As Jericho and Clara rode back to the ranch that evening, the sun setting in a blaze of glory, they felt victorious. They didn't see the thin trails of smoke starting to rise from the northern ridge of the Double Rock grazing lands. They didn't know that the war had just begun. For 3 weeks following the confrontation in town, the Double Rock Ranch existed in a state of suspended bliss. It was a fragile, golden time. The yellow calico curtains Clara had sewn now hung in the windows, casting a warm, honeyed light across the once gloomy floors of the main house. The scent of stale tobacco and loneliness had been replaced by the smell of baking bread, lemon oil, and wildflowers. Clara and Jericho had fallen into a rhythm that felt dangerously like a marriage, though neither dared to speak the word. Jericho worked the herds with a renewed vigor, knowing there was a hot meal and a warm smile waiting for him at sundown. Clara, for her part, had stopped walking with her head down. She moved through the house with authority. She hummed as she worked. She even began to wear her hair loose in the evenings, the long brown waves cascading over her shoulders, softening the sharp angles of her face. But happiness in the West is often just a pause between tragedies. It was a Tuesday in late August when the wind changed. The air turned stagnant and heavy, pressing down on the valley like a wool blanket. Clara was on the back porch churning butter. The rhythmic thump splash of the dasher was hypnotic. Jericho was in the corral shoeing a roan mare. Clara stopped churning. She sniffed the air. It wasn't the smell of rain. It was acrid, sharp, like burning cedar and scorched hair. "Jericho," she called out, standing up. The sudden movement made the porch floorboards creak, a sound she no longer flinched at. Jericho dropped the horse's hoof and stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked north toward the ridgeline. A thin grey ribbon was curling up against the blue sky. "Fire," he muttered. He grabbed his rifle from the fence post, but it wasn't a wildfire. The smoke wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the hay storage at the north pasture. "Stay here," Jericho commanded, swinging into the saddle of the nearest horse. "Get inside, lock the doors, have the shotgun ready." "Jericho, wait!" Clara cried, her heart seizing. "It's the rustlers," he shouted over the rising wind. "They're trying to draw me out. Don't open the door for anyone but me." He galloped off a dark silhouette, disappearing into the dust. Clara didn't freeze. She didn't panic. The old Clara, the one who hid in the back of the mercantile, might have cowered under the bed. But this Clara had tamed midnight. This Clara was the mistress of the Double Rock. She marched inside, bolted the heavy oak front door, and dropped the iron bar across the back entrance. She went to the gun cabinet. Jericho had taught her how to load the double-barreled shotgun. "It kicks like a mule," he had told her. "Lean into it. Put your weight behind it." My weight, she thought grimly. Finally something useful. She loaded the weapon and stood in the center of the living room, listening. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The smell of smoke grew stronger, seeping through the cracks in the window frames. Then she heard it. Not the thunder of hooves, but the stealthy crunch of boots on the gravel outside. "Come on out, little lady," a voice sneered from the front porch. It wasn't Buford Clancy. It was rougher, deeper. Clara said nothing. She raised the shotgun, aiming it at the door. "We know you're in there," the voice continued. "Staines is busy with the fire. We just want to talk. Maybe have a little look around." The doorknob rattled. Then a heavy shoulder slammed against the wood. The oak held. "Break a window," another voice commanded. Glass shattered in the dining room. Clara moved. She didn't run away. She moved toward the sound. She stepped into the dining room just as a man climbed through the broken window. He was a filthy, bearded man, with a red sash tied around his arm, the mark of the ruthless gang that worked the border. He looked up and saw Clara. He grinned, revealing rotted teeth. "Well, now that's a lot of woman. Plenty to go around." He underestimated her. He saw a fat woman in an apron. He didn't see the rage of a woman defending her home. "Get out," Clara said, her voice steady. "Or what? You gonna sit on me?" He laughed, stepping forward, drawing a knife. Clara pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. She had aimed high, blowing the top of the window frame into splinters, showering the man with glass and wood. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but her mass absorbed it. She didn't stumble. The man yelled in surprise and covered his face, backing up. "The next one is for your chest," Clara warned, cocking the second barrel. "She's crazy," the man yelled to his friends outside. "She's armed." "Burn it," a voice screamed from the yard. "Burn the house down with the sow inside." Clara's blood ran cold. She heard the sound of liquid splashing against the siding kerosene, then the whoosh of ignition. The flames caught instantly on the dry timber. The room began to fill with black, choking smoke. Clara coughed, her eyes watering. She had to get out. But the front and back were covered by men with guns. She ran to the kitchen, the cellar door. She threw open the trapdoor in the floor and scrambled down the wooden ladder into the root cellar. It was cool and dark. She could hear the fire roaring above her, the crackle of the floorboards consuming her beautiful yellow curtains, the table where she and Jericho had eaten the life they had built. Tears streamed down her face, but she forced herself to move. The cellar had an outside storm doors, heavy iron flaps that opened into the garden. She pushed them open just an inch. Through the slit, she saw the red sashes mounting up. "Let's go," the leader shouted. "Staines will see the smoke. We ambush him at the creek crossing." They rode off, hooting and hollering. Clara pushed the doors open and scrambled out into the garden. The house was a torch. The heat was blistering. She didn't mourn the house. She thought only of one thing: ambush. Creek crossing. They were going to kill Jericho. She ran to the barn. It was untouched by the fire so far. Midnight was pacing in his stall, smelling the smoke. "Easy, boy," Clara gasped, throwing a bridle over his head. She didn't bother with a saddle. She couldn't lift the heavy western saddle fast enough. She led the massive black stallion out to the mounting block. She was terrified. She had ridden horses before, but never midnight and never bareback. "Please," she whispered into his ear. "You have to carry me. I'm heavy, I know, but he needs us." The horse stood rock still. Clara climbed onto the block and threw her leg over his broad back. He shifted under her weight, chuffing, but he didn't buck. He felt her urgency. "Go!" Clara screamed, digging her heels in. Midnight launched forward. He didn't run like a plow horse. He ran like the wind itself. Clara clung to his mane, her body pressed low against his neck as they thundered out of the yard, leaving the burning house behind, racing toward the creek to save the man who had saved her. The dry creek crossing was a narrow gorge about 2 miles from the ranch house, where the water cut deep through the limestone. It was a natural choke point, the perfect place for a kill box. Jericho Staines rode hard, his face grim. He had put out the hay fire. It had been small, a distraction just as he feared. But when he saw the black plume rising from the direction of his house, panic cold and sharp pierced his chest. "Clara." He pushed his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, to its limit. He approached the crossing, his eyes scanning the ridges. It was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. He pulled back on the reins. Whoa! Crack! A rifle shot rang out from the rocks above. Jericho felt the impact before he heard the sound. It felt like a sledgehammer hitting his left thigh. The force knocked him clean out of the saddle. He hit the dirt hard, rolling instinctively as a second bullet kicked up dust where his head had been. His horse screamed and bolted. Jericho scrambled behind a fallen log, gasping for air. He looked down at his leg. Blood was pulsing dark and fast through his denim jeans. The femoral artery. No, it was lower, but it was bad. He couldn't stand. "Give it up, Staines," a voice echoed from the rocks. It was Silas. "We got you pinned, and don't worry about the fat girl. We roasted her like a Christmas pig." The world went red. A primal roar tore from Jericho's throat. He didn't care about the pain anymore. He didn't care about the odds. If Clara was dead, he was going to take every single one of them to hell with him. He propped his Winchester rifle on the log and fired. One bandit dropped from the rocks. "Suppressing fire!" Silas yelled. 5 guns opened up on Jericho's position. Wood chips flew into his face. He was pinned. He was bleeding out. He had 20 rounds left in his rifle and 6 in his revolver. He checked his pocket watch. It was smashed. "I'm sorry, Clara," he thought, his vision blurring. "I couldn't protect you." Then he felt the vibration in the ground, a rhythmic, thundering drumming, hoofbeats, heavy ones. The bandits stopped firing, looking toward the south. "What is that?" one yelled. "Posse." Around the bend of the canyon, a black blur appeared. It was midnight, and riding him, hair flying like a war banner, face streaked with soot and tears, was Claraara May. She wasn't riding away from the danger. She was riding straight into it. "No!" Jericho screamed. Clara turned back. She didn't hear him, or she didn't care. She saw the men on the rocks. She saw Jericho trapped behind the log. She steered the massive stallion directly at the cluster of horses the bandits had tied up near the creek bed. Midnight, sensing the battle, let out a terrifying scream and charged. The bandits' horses panicked. They broke their tethers and scattered. "Shoot the horse!" Silas screamed. Bullets whizzed past Clara. She felt a tug on her skirt as a round passed through the fabric. She bent lower, becoming one with the animal. Midnight slammed into the flank of the nearest bandit's mount, sending the man flying. She rode straight to the log where Jericho lay. She pulled Midnight to a sliding halt, the dust cloud covering them. "Get on!" she screamed, reaching down. Jericho looked up at her. She looked like a Valkyrie. She looked beautiful. "My leg," he gasped. "I can't climb." Clara didn't hesitate. She slid off the horse landing heavily in the dirt. Bullets were pinging off the rocks around them. "Grab the mane," she ordered. Her voice was guttural fierce. She grabbed Jericho by the back of his belt and his collar. "Clara, you can't." "Hush." With a grunt that came from the very depths of her soul, Clara squatted and lifted. She lifted 220 pounds of dead weight. Her knees popped. Her back screamed. But she channeled every ounce of the mass the town had mocked, every pound of the body they called a burden, and she turned it into power. She threw him over the horse's withers like a sack of grain. Jericho groaned, grabbing the mane. Clara scrambled up behind him, her adrenaline overriding her exhaustion. "Go, Midnight, go." The stallion, carrying nearly 500 pounds of rider, dug his hooves into the soft earth and launched himself forward. He was a beast of immense power, bred for war, not racing, and his strength saved them. He scrambled up the steep bank on the far side of the creek, putting rock between them and the shooters. They rode hard for 3 miles, up into the high trails of the Devil's Spine, a path too narrow and treacherous for the bandits to follow quickly. They found shelter in an abandoned prospector's cave as the sun began to set. Clara slid off the horse and helped Jericho down. He collapsed onto the dirt floor, pale as a sheet. His pant leg was soaked in blood. "The fire," Jericho whispered, his teeth chattering from shock. "They said they burned you." "They burned the house," Clara said, ripping her petticoat into strips. "Not me. I'm hard to burn." She worked quickly. She cut open his pant leg. The bullet had passed through the meat of the thigh, missing the bone and the main artery. But he had lost a lot of blood. "This is going to hurt," she said. "Do it," Jericho gritted out. She packed the wound tight with the cloth, binding it with brutal pressure. Jericho cried out, arching his back, his hand gripping Clara's wrist. He squeezed so hard it bruised, but she didn't pull away. She leaned over him, whispering soft comforts, wiping the sweat from his face with her soot-stained hands. Night fell. The cave was cold. Jericho shivered violently. Blood loss had left him freezing. "Cold," he mumbled. "So cold." Clara looked around. There was no wood for a fire, and lighting one would give away their position anyway. She hesitated only a moment. She lay down on the dirt floor beside him. She pulled his heavy coat over both of them. Then she pressed her body against his. Her softness, her warmth, the very sighs that she had cursed for so long, became his lifeline. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling his head onto her chest. She was a furnace of life in the freezing dark. "Clara," Jericho whispered into the curve of her neck. His voice was slurred. "I'm here," she said, stroking his hair. "They were wrong," he murmured. "Who everyone? Buford, the town." He took a shaky breath. "They said, sent the big girl as a joke. But you're not a joke, Clara. You're a fortress. You're the only thing that's real." Clara's heart swelled in her chest, painful and sweet. "Rest now, Jericho. I've got at you. I love you." He breathed out the words, slipping out just before consciousness left him. "Should have told you sooner." Clara lay there in the dark, holding the man she loved, listening to the wind howl outside. She wasn't the invisible girl anymore. She was the woman who had ridden into gunfire. She was the woman who was keeping this man alive with her own heat. She kissed his forehead. "I love you too, Cowboy, and we aren't done yet." But outside, the sound of falling rocks echoed. The red sashes hadn't given up. They were tracking the blood trail. They were coming to finish the job, and Clara had no bullets left. Dawn broke over the Devil's Spine, painting the rocks in blood-red hues. Clara hadn't slept. She sat at the mouth of the cave, clutching a heavy, jagged rock, her only weapon. Jericho was unconscious, his breathing shallow behind her. Footsteps crunched on the scree. Silas appeared, his face smeared with soot, his pistol drawn. He smiled when he saw her. "End of the road, Clara," he sneered, raising the gun. "Move aside, and I'll make it quick." Clara stood up. She didn't move aside. She planted her feet, blocking the cave entrance completely. "You'll have to shoot through me to get to him. Have it your way." Silas spat his finger, tightening on the trigger. Bang! The gunshot echoed violently through the canyon. Clara flinched, waiting for the pain. But it was Silas who screamed. His pistol flew from his hand, shattered by a bullet from a high-powered rifle. "Drop it!" a booming voice echoed from the ridge. Sheriff Miller stood high on the cliff, a smoking repeater in his hand. Behind him stood a dozen men, ranch hands, shopkeepers, and even the blacksmith. They had seen the smoke from the double rock. They had seen the flames consuming the home of the man who had just saved the town's economy. Silas fell to his knees as the posse descended. The nightmare was over. Beaufort Clancy was arrested that afternoon, found hiding in his father's cellar. His arson had been his undoing. With Jericho holding the banknotes, the Clancy empire crumbled within a week. Jericho kept his leg. It took 3 months for him to walk again, and he did so with a limp leaning heavily on a cane. But he never walked alone. They rebuilt the house bigger this time, with a kitchen designed specifically for Clara's comfort and wide porches for watching the sunset. They married in the spring. Clara didn't wear a corset to squeeze herself into a mold. She wore a dress of yellow silk that flowed like water. And when Jericho Staines kissed his bride, the town didn't laugh. They cheered. They cheered for the obese girl who tamed the beast not with a whip, but with the unstoppable weight of her love. And that is how Claraara May proved that the size of your heart matters far more than the size of your waist. The town wanted a joke, but they got a legend instead. Jericho and Clara lived out their days at the Double Rock, reminding everyone that true strength isn't about looking perfect. It's about standing your ground when the fire starts to burn. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a saga. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by people who didn't know your true worth? I read every comment. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.